She was never supposed to be there, and yet fate had placed her in the back seat of a black luxury car, the leather still warm, the city lights of New York blurring past the tinted windows like a dream she hadn't agreed to enter. Her name was Elena Carter, a 24-year-old graduate student who believed life followed rules: work hard, stay honest, and trouble would somehow stay away, but that belief cracked the moment the car slowed to a stop and the door opened from the outside. The night air rushed in, heavy with rain and danger, and before she could speak or even think, a man stood there who didn't belong to ordinary rules. He was tall, dressed in a dark tailored coat, his presence calm but terrifying, the kind of calm that came from knowing the world bent when he spoke. This was not the man she expected to see, this wasn't his brother, whose driver she had mistaken in her panic earlier that evening. This was Adrian Moretti, a name whispered in the city's darker corners, a man tied to power, money, and violence in ways people pretended not to know about. Elena's heart slammed against her ribs as their eyes met, and in that single glance, she felt something shift, an invisible line crossed. Adrian didn't shout, didn't threaten, he simply looked at her as if he had already decided something important. "You're with me," he said quietly, his voice low and controlled, and that sentence alone carried more authority than any scream. Elena tried to explain, her words tumbling out about a mistake, about thinking this was someone else's car, but the sound of her own voice felt small, almost irrelevant. Adrian listened without interrupting, then closed the door gently, signaling the driver to move. The car pulled back into traffic, and Elena realized she was no longer just in the wrong place, she was moving deeper into a world she didn't understand. Memories flooded her mind as the city rushed by, leaving the library late, the rain starting suddenly, her phone dying, the familiar black car she assumed belonged to someone she knew. One wrong moment, one wrong assumption, and now she sat inches away from a man who controlled entire neighborhoods with a phone call. Adrian studied her in silence, not like prey, but like a puzzle, as if her presence intrigued him more than it annoyed him. Outside, Manhattan glowed, unaware that an ordinary woman's life was quietly being rewritten inside a moving vehicle. Elena tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself she was strong, that fear would only give him power, but it was hard not to feel small next to someone whose reputation filled rooms even when he wasn't there. Adrian finally spoke again, asking her name, her voice shaking slightly as she answered, surprised that he even cared. He nodded once, as if storing the information for later, then looked away toward the city skyline, lost in thought. What Elena didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that Adrian hadn't opened that door by accident. He had seen her earlier that night through the cafe window, laughing softly at something on her phone, completely untouched by the darkness he lived in, and something about that contrast had stayed with him. She didn't belong in his world, and that was exactly why he noticed her. As the car crossed the bridge into a quieter part of the city, Elena felt the weight of uncertainty settle in her chest. She didn't know where they were going, how long this night would last, or what Adrian Moretti truly wanted from her, but she knew, with a clarity that frightened her, that her life before this moment was already slipping away. The car slowed as it turned into a private underground garage beneath a towering building of glass and steel, far from the noise of Manhattan's main streets, and Elena felt a knot tighten in her stomach as the echo of tires against concrete replaced the sound of rain. She watched the metal gate close behind them, sealing her inside a world that felt deliberately hidden from ordinary life. Adrian stepped out first, adjusting his coat with calm precision, then opened her door again, not roughly, not gently either, just confidently, as if this moment had always been meant to happen. Elena hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run, but reason reminded her she was alone, phone dead, surrounded by people who answered to him. She stepped out, her shoes clicking softly on the concrete floor, and followed as Adrian led her toward a private elevator guarded by two men who nodded without question. No one asked who she was. That silence frightened her more than words ever could. Inside the elevator, the doors closed smoothly, and the ascent began, the hum of machinery filling the space between them. Elena's reflection stared back at her from the mirrored walls, wide eyes, tense shoulders, a woman trying not to fall apart. Adrian broke the silence by telling her she was safe, a sentence that sounded reassuring on the surface but unsettling beneath it, because safety in his world clearly came with conditions. She asked him why she was here, her voice steadier than she felt, and he studied her again before answering honestly that he didn't fully know yet. That uncertainty unsettled her more than a clear threat would have. The elevator opened into a penthouse that felt more like a fortress than a home, clean lines, muted colors, massive windows overlooking the city like a kingdom under watch. Adrian gestured for her to sit, and despite every instinct to remain standing, she obeyed, sinking into a leather chair that felt too expensive to belong to her life. He poured himself a drink but offered her water instead, a small gesture that confused her expectations. She asked again why he had chosen her, why a man like him would care about a simple mistake, and Adrian leaned against the counter, his expression distant, as if choosing his words carefully. He told her that his brother had enemies, that mistakes like hers often ended badly, and that by stepping into that car, she had unknowingly placed herself in danger. Protecting her, he said, was partly damage control, but not entirely. Elena listened, trying to separate truth from manipulation, but something in his tone felt real, almost reluctant. He asked about her life, where she worked, what she studied, why she had been out so late, and as she answered, she realized how little she knew about the world he occupied and how much he seemed to notice about hers. Adrian admitted that people around him were usually predictable, driven by fear or greed, while she was neither, and that unpredictability had caught his attention. Elena pushed back, telling him she wanted to leave, that this wasn't her fight, and Adrian didn't argue. Instead, he explained calmly that letting her go immediately could put her at risk until he confirmed certain things. That explanation felt logical, yet terrifying, because it meant her freedom depended on decisions she wasn't part of. Hours passed quietly as rain streaked down the windows, the city glowing below like another universe, and Elena found herself trapped not by chains or threats but by circumstance and a man who controlled it effortlessly. She wondered what people would think if they could see her now, sitting in a mafia boss's penthouse, talking about normal things like school and family, as if this were a strange dinner party rather than a dangerous turning point. Adrian eventually told her she would stay the night, in a guest room guarded discreetly, until morning brought clarity, and while every part of her wanted to protest, exhaustion weighed heavy in her bones. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed later, staring at the ceiling, Elena realized the fear she felt wasn't just about being held in a powerful man's space, it was about the growing sense that he was not the monster she expected, and that realization was somehow even more dangerous. She didn't know it yet, but the line between protection and possession was already beginning to blur, and the night she thought would never end was only the beginning of something far more complicated. Morning arrived slowly in the penthouse, filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows that softened the city's sharp edges, and Elena woke with a jolt of confusion before memory rushed back like cold water. Black car, quiet command, Adrian Moretti. For a few seconds she lay still, listening, half expecting guards or locked doors, but the room was silent except for the distant hum of traffic far below. The guest room felt carefully designed to be comforting, neutral colors, clean sheets, no visible cameras, but that only reminded her how deliberately everything here was controlled. She dressed in the clothes laid out for her, simple and tasteful, and wondered who had chosen them and how much of her life was already being observed. When she stepped into the main living area, Adrian was already awake, standing near the windows with a phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and efficient as he gave instructions that sounded like business but carried an undercurrent of authority that made people move. He ended the call and turned toward her, assessing her quietly, as if noting every detail she didn't realize she revealed. He offered coffee, asked if she'd slept, small talk that felt strangely normal, and Elena found herself answering honestly, surprised by how the tension eased just a fraction in daylight. Adrian explained that overnight he had confirmed what he needed. She wasn't connected to his brother's enemies, hadn't been followed, hadn't been used as a pawn, and technically, she was free to leave. Relief washed through her, followed almost immediately by confusion when he didn't move aside or call for a car. Instead, he told her there was still a problem. People who knew she had been in that car, even briefly, might assume she knew more than she did, and assumptions in his world could be deadly. Elena felt the fear return, sharper now because it came with logic she couldn't argue against. Adrian proposed a solution that sounded like protection but felt like entanglement. He would keep her close for a short time, visible enough to signal she was under his watch, until interest faded. She pushed back, accusing him of using safety as an excuse for control, and for the first time his calm expression cracked, revealing something heavier beneath it. He admitted control was part of how he survived, that letting go of variables often led to bloodshed, and that she had become a variable he couldn't ignore. The honesty unsettled her more than threats ever could. As the day unfolded, Elena remained in the penthouse, watching Adrian move through meetings and calls, noticing how people deferred to him without question, how his power wasn't loud but absolute. He didn't hide her presence, nor did he flaunt it, she was simply there, an unspoken detail that changed the room's dynamics. At one point, he invited her to join him on the terrace, and as they stood overlooking the city, he spoke about growing up surrounded by violence, about learning early that softness was dangerous but isolation was worse. Elena listened, realizing that beneath the tailored suit and controlled voice was a man shaped by necessity rather than choice, and that understanding complicated her anger. She told him about her own life, her parents' modest expectations, her plans for a future that now felt fragile, and admitted she was terrified of what being near him could cost her. Adrian didn't dismiss her fear, instead, he acknowledged it as rational, which somehow made it heavier. By evening, news broke on a muted television about a disrupted criminal operation downtown, and Elena noticed the subtle shift in Adrian's posture as he watched, the strategist always calculating consequences. He assured her again that she wasn't a prisoner, but when she asked when she could truly leave, his pause was long enough to answer the question without words. As night fell, the city lights came alive once more, and Elena realized that the danger she faced wasn't only external, it was the slow, unsettling pull of a world where rules were different, where morality blurred, and where one man's protection could become another form of captivity. She lay awake that night not because she feared Adrian's power, but because she feared how quickly she was adapting to it, how easily the extraordinary was beginning to feel normal, and how that normalization might cost her the life she once thought was secure. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm, and Elena began to understand that time moved differently inside Adrian Moretti's world, stretching and compressing according to decisions made behind closed doors and phone calls whispered in guarded tones. She was allowed outside now, but never alone, always accompanied by discreet security that kept a respectful distance while ensuring she was never truly out of reach. Adrian framed it as freedom with precautions, and while part of her resented the invisible leash, another part recognized the strange privilege of being protected in a city that suddenly felt less forgiving than before. They visited quiet cafes where owners greeted Adrian with nervous politeness, art galleries that closed early for private viewings, and rooftop spaces where the city spread endlessly below them, reminding Elena that New York held 1,000 lives she could see but no longer touch. With each outing, she felt herself slipping further from the version of life she once knew, replaced by a heightened awareness of power dynamics and unspoken rules. Adrian, for his part, seemed to be testing boundaries of his own, alternating between professional distance and moments of unexpected openness. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, he told her about his brother, the reckless ambition, the mistakes that created enemies, and the burden of constantly cleaning up chaos that wasn't entirely his own. Elena listened, realizing that the danger surrounding her wasn't accidental, it was the overflow of a system built on loyalty and fear. She challenged him, asking whether any of it was worth the cost, and for a moment he didn't answer, his silence louder than any justification. Tension peaked when news arrived that someone had been asking questions about her, vague inquiries that suggested curiosity rather than intent, but curiosity in Adrian's world often led to worse things. He tightened security immediately, and Elena bristled at the sudden restrictions, accusing him of turning concern into confinement. Their argument was sharp but controlled, two people used to holding their ground in different ways, and when Adrian finally admitted that the idea of losing control over the situation unsettled him more than he liked, Elena recognized the truth beneath the admission: this wasn't just strategy anymore. That realization scared her more than any threat from outside. Later that night, unable to sleep, she wandered onto the terrace and found Adrian there already, staring out at the city as if searching for answers it refused to give. In the quiet, they spoke more honestly than before, about fear, about choice, about how easily lines blurred when survival was at stake. Adrian told her he had built his life around inevitability, believing outcomes were fixed if you understood the rules, but she was an anomaly, a variable he couldn't predict or control completely. Elena confessed that despite everything, part of her felt safer near him than she ever should, and that frightened her because safety shouldn't come at the cost of autonomy. As days turned into another week, the outside interest slowly faded, but the internal tension only deepened. Adrian assured her that soon she could return to her life, yet the promise sounded less certain each time it was repeated, weighed down by unspoken reluctance. Elena found herself wondering whether leaving would truly mean freedom or simply another kind of danger, one without his protection. The thought unsettled her, forcing her to confront an uncomfortable truth: she was no longer just reacting to circumstances, she was emotionally invested in the outcome. When a late-night call pulled Adrian away abruptly, his demeanor shifting to cold focus, Elena watched him disappear into his world and felt an unexpected sense of loss. She realized then that whatever happened next, whether she stayed or left, she would never return unchanged to the life she had before. The city outside continued to glow, indifferent to her inner conflict, but Elena understood that the moment she stepped into the wrong car had set her on a path that could not be undone, and the greatest danger now lay not in Adrian's enemies, but in the choices she would soon have to make for herself. The late-night call that pulled Adrian away stretched into hours, and Elena spent that time pacing the penthouse, acutely aware of how quiet the space felt without his steady presence anchoring it. Every sound, the soft hum of appliances, the distant sirens echoing through the city, seemed amplified, reminding her that she was suspended between two worlds, fully belonging to neither. When Adrian finally returned, his expression was controlled but harder than she had seen before, the kind of hardness that came from decisions made with consequences he couldn't afford to explain. He assured her everything was handled, but the tension in his shoulders told a different story. Over the next few days, the protective bubble tightened again, subtle but unmistakable, and Elena sensed that something had shifted beyond her view. She pressed him for answers, unwilling to remain passive, and he reluctantly admitted that a rival group had interpreted her presence as leverage, a miscalculation he had moved quickly to correct. The implication was clear. Her involvement, however unintentional, had altered the balance of power. Elena felt a surge of guilt mixed with anger, accusing him of dragging her deeper instead of letting her go when he had the chance, and Adrian didn't deny it. Instead, he confessed that letting her disappear quietly no longer felt like an option, not because of strategy, but because he didn't trust the world to leave her untouched once it had noticed her. That admission landed heavily between them, exposing a truth neither had fully named. She mattered to him in a way that complicated everything. Their conversations grew more intense, stripped of pretense, as Elena demanded to understand the reality of his life, not the curated version he allowed outsiders to see. Adrian spoke of alliances maintained through obligation rather than loyalty, of choices that narrowed until there were none left that felt clean, and of the constant calculation required to keep violence contained. Elena listened, recognizing that while his world was dangerous, it was also meticulously ordered, and that order was beginning to make a disturbing kind of sense to her. The realization frightened her. Understanding was a step toward acceptance, and acceptance felt like betrayal of the values she had carried her whole life. One afternoon, Adrian took her to a quiet waterfront area outside the city, a place untouched by the chaos she now associated with him, and for a brief moment, she saw the man he might have been under different circumstances. They talked openly there, about what it would mean for her to leave, about the risks and the logistics, about the version of safety that didn't rely on his influence. Adrian promised that when the time came, he would ensure her protection extended beyond his immediate reach, but the promise felt fragile, threatened by forces neither could fully control. As evening settled, Elena faced a decision she had been avoiding: whether to push harder for her old life or acknowledge that returning unchanged was impossible. She began to consider what agency meant in a situation where every option carried danger, and whether choosing proximity to power was inherently wrong if it offered a chance to shape outcomes rather than be crushed by them. That night, a minor incident, security intercepting a curious journalist, brought the reality crashing back, and Elena understood how easily her anonymity could vanish. Adrian handled it swiftly, but the scare left her shaken, forcing her to confront the truth that exposure was now as much a threat as violence. In the aftermath, she told Adrian she needed clarity, not promises, and asked him directly what he wanted from her. He didn't answer immediately, his silence stretching until it became its own confession, and when he finally spoke, he admitted that he didn't know how to separate protection from attachment anymore. The honesty was unsettling but grounding, stripping away illusions and leaving them both exposed. As Elena lay awake later, staring out at the city lights reflected in the glass, she realized that the story she was living no longer belonged solely to circumstance or mistake. It was being shaped by conscious choices, hers included. Whatever came next would demand courage, not just to survive the dangers around her, but to define herself within them. And for the first time since stepping into the wrong car, she felt the weight of that responsibility settle firmly in her hands. The clarity Elena demanded did not arrive cleanly or all at once. Instead, it unfolded through a series of moments that forced her to confront the reality of what staying, or leaving, would truly mean, and the first of those moments came when Adrian invited her to sit in on a meeting she was never meant to hear. It wasn't dramatic or violent, just a quiet discussion between powerful people, but the weight of every word hung heavy in the air, decisions shaping livelihoods and futures without a hint of sentimentality. Elena listened, not because she wanted to, but because she needed to understand the machinery that now brushed against her life, and what she heard unsettled her more than fear ever had. Adrian wasn't cruel or reckless. He was deliberate, choosing outcomes that minimized damage while preserving control, and that nuance complicated the simple moral lines she had relied on for comfort.
Afterward, she confronted him privately, accusing him of letting her see too much, and he admitted he had done it intentionally, not to trap her, but to give her the truth she said she wanted. He told her that ignorance was a kind of safety, but it was also a weakness, and if she chose to stay near him in any capacity, she deserved to understand the risks fully. That honesty felt heavy but respectful, and Elena realized that for the first time, he was treating her not as something to protect, but as someone capable of choosing. The days that followed were quieter, but charged with unspoken tension as Elena weighed options that felt equally dangerous. Returning to her old life meant anonymity but vulnerability, trusting that the ripples caused by that single night would fade completely. Staying meant proximity to power, protection layered with expectation, and a future that would never be simple again. Adrian didn't pressure her, but his presence alone influenced her thoughts, a constant reminder that her decision affected more than just herself. One evening, he shared something he had never told anyone outside his inner circle, how he had once tried to walk away from his world, believing distance could erase obligation, only to learn that power never truly releases those who hold it. That confession reframed Elena's understanding of him. He wasn't clinging to control because he enjoyed it, but because he knew what chaos followed when it slipped away. When news arrived that his brother had made another mistake, drawing renewed attention from rivals, Elena saw the familiar tightening in Adrian's expression, the strategist resurfacing without hesitation. She offered to remove herself from the situation, to leave before she became a distraction, and for the first time, he didn't immediately refuse. Instead, he asked her to give him time, to ensure that her departure wouldn't expose her to retaliation or scrutiny, and that request felt different from before, grounded more in mutual respect than possession. As plans quietly formed around them, Elena began preparing herself mentally for departure, reconnecting with fragments of her old life through cautious messages and half-formed explanations. Yet with each step toward leaving, she felt an unexpected pull backward, a sense that she was abandoning something unresolved. Adrian, sensing the shift, grew more distant but not colder, as if bracing himself for an outcome he had accepted but didn't welcome. The night before a tentative exit plan was to be finalized, an incident forced everything into sharp focus. A breach in security, minor but intentional, designed to send a message rather than cause harm. Adrian handled it swiftly, ensuring Elena was safe without escalating the situation, but the message was clear, eyes were still watching, calculating. In the aftermath, Elena realized that her safety, even outside his immediate reach, would always be indirectly tied to him, at least for a time. She confronted him with this realization, and instead of denying it, he acknowledged the uncomfortable truth. Their lives were now linked, not by choice alone, but by circumstance. That admission changed something between them, stripping away the illusion that there was a clean break waiting on the other side of her decision. Elena spent the night awake, thinking not about fear or attraction, but about agency, about whether choosing a difficult path was worse than pretending an easier one still existed. By morning, she understood that whatever she decided next would not be about escaping danger, but about defining the terms under which she would face it. She met Adrian at the windows as the city woke below them, and though no words were spoken yet, both understood that the conversation they were about to have would shape everything that followed, bringing the story closer to a turning point neither could avoid. The conversation that followed as the city stirred awake was quiet but decisive, and Elena realized that endings in real life rarely arrived with drama, they came with clarity earned through exhaustion and honesty. She told Adrian she wasn't choosing safety over freedom or power over principle. She was choosing responsibility, the kind that acknowledged consequences without surrendering identity. She admitted that leaving outright, pretending nothing had happened, would be a lie she couldn't live with, yet staying indefinitely under his protection would erode the independence she valued just as deeply. Adrian listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, then surprised her by agreeing. He said the only way forward was a defined path with boundaries neither of them would blur, a plan that reduced risk without rewriting who she was allowed to be. Together they outlined it carefully. Elena would return to her life publicly, resume her studies, rebuild routine, while privately maintaining limited, transparent contact through a secure channel until interest in her fully dissipated. Adrian would ensure the rumors cooled, redirecting attention with deliberate visibility elsewhere, making it clear she was neither leverage nor liability. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was honest, and honesty felt like the rarest currency in his world. The days that followed were a controlled unraveling of the bubble. Farewells disguised as logistics, protective details thinned without disappearing, explanations prepared that were true enough to stand without inviting questions. Elena packed slowly, noticing how the penthouse no longer felt like a fortress or a sanctuary, just a place she had passed through on her way to becoming someone more aware of how fragile certainty could be. On the morning she left, Adrian drove her himself, an intentional signal as much as a courtesy, and the city greeted her with familiar chaos that felt strangely grounding. He stopped where it all began, not far from the library, the street wet with last night's rain, and for a moment they sat in silence, neither rushing what came next. Adrian told her she had changed the way he measured risk, that variables weren't always threats, sometimes they were corrections, and Elena replied that he had changed the way she understood power, not as something inherently corrupt, but as something that demanded accountability whether one wanted it or not. There was no promise of reunion, no dramatic confession, just mutual recognition that what they shared had been real precisely because it had limits. She stepped out of the car, the door closing softly behind her, and watched it pull away, disappearing into traffic like any other vehicle, leaving her alone with a life that felt both familiar and newly complex. The weeks that followed tested the plan. Whispers surfaced and faded, curiosity flared and cooled, and Elena learned how to live with a heightened awareness that never fully switched off. She threw herself into work, into friendships, into the ordinary courage of showing up, and slowly the fear loosened its grip, replaced by a steadier confidence rooted in experience rather than innocence. Occasionally, a secure message arrived, brief, factual, confirming that things remained quiet, and each time she felt relief not because he was watching, but because the watching was no longer the point. Months later, when a headline broke about a reshaped alliance and a quieter underworld, Elena understood that Adrian had done what he said he would, absorbing attention and redirecting it away from her life. She never saw him again, not in person, but she recognized his influence in the absence of threat, in the space reclaimed by normalcy. One evening, as she walked past the same cafe, where she had once laughed at her phone, she paused, realizing that the story she carried wasn't about a mafia boss or a wrong car, it was about choice made under pressure and the refusal to let fear dictate identity. She had been changed, undeniably, but not diminished. The city continued on, indifferent and alive, and Elena stepped back into it fully, no longer naive, no longer trapped, aware that fate could open doors without permission, but it was still up to her to decide which ones she would walk through.